So today I want to share some thoughts about social kinds and what they are. And I hope this video will be useful in acquainting you with at least my take on what social kinds are. So this video is going to be divided into three parts. I'll start by talking about some historical precedents to ground my account of social kinds in a certain historical tradition. And then I'll present briefly what I'm going to call a naturalist account of natural kinds. And then I'm going to talk about kinds specifically in the social domain. So the account of natural kinds that I'm going to try and articulate, I think, can be traced back to the 19th century, in particular the work of philosophers like William Whewell. William Whewell is one of the maybe earliest philosophers of science in the modern sense, and he actually coined the term scientist. And he was interested in classification schemes and the way in which scientists classify their domains, their subject matter. And at some point, he writes that classification of plants on the basis of the numbers of pistils and stamens in their flowers is artificial, not natural. And what he means by that is that this classification doesn't reveal any other similarities among plants. So it doesn't enable us to make significant generalizations. So when we classify plants on the basis of the numbers of pistils and stamens in their flowers, that doesn't tell you anything else about those plants. It doesn't enable you to make any kind of general statements. And so that's why he thinks it's an artificial classification as opposed to what he calls a natural classification. Now, a contemporary of his, Jon Stewart Mill, perhaps a more famous philosopher, agrees with Whewell on this score, and he was quite influenced by Whewell on this subject and also influenced Whewell. They had a kind of dialogue going on. And Mill says members of kinds share a large number of properties. So when you classify things not artificially, but in a natural classification scheme, that reveals kinds. And kinds share a large number of properties. And that means that a multitude of general assertions can be made about them, and they serve as the basis for inductive inference. You can now project from certain instances that you've observed that have a certain set of properties that other instances will also share those same properties. So he says that this applies not just in the natural domain, biology, geology, mineralogy, and so on, but also perhaps in the social domain. So he says the various races and temperaments, the two sexes, and even the various ages may be differences of kind within our meaning of the term. So as he's using the term, kinds are, members of kinds share a large number of properties. And this pertains not just in the natural domain, but also it pertains to the social domain. And John Venn, who was writing a little later and was influenced by Mill and also Whewell, agrees with this. So he says if we classify plants not on the basis of color, but on the structure of the seed, a number of other attributes will be associated with it. So color is an artificial classification scheme when it comes to plants, but the structure of the seed is a natural classification scheme. And a natural classification scheme reveals kinds. And Venn went on to say that Mill introduced the technical term of natural kinds to express such classes as these. So when you classify not artificially or arbitrarily, but according to some natural classification scheme, what you are revealing are kinds. Now, he introduced the phrase natural kinds. He attributed it to Mill, but interestingly enough, Mill doesn't ever seem to have used the phrase natural kinds. So it might be that John Venn was just misremembering. He unwittingly coined the phrase natural kinds, and we are now stuck with it, perhaps due to a misremembering on Venn's part of Mill's term. Mill talks about kinds. Occasionally he says real kinds, but he never says natural kinds. Now, as I'll try to say, I think the phrase is a bit unfortunate, but we seem to be stuck with it. And so it's become the standard way of talking about real groupings in nature that are revealed by these natural classification schemes. So you might say, well, according to naturalists, what do such categories have in common? What do natural classification schemes reveal? What is it that is so special about natural classification schemes as opposed to arbitrary ones? Well, as Whewell, Mill, and Venn all thought, natural classification schemes pick out clusters of properties. So the categories that a natural classification scheme divides a certain domain into, each of those categories is characterized by a number of properties that are all associated together. But you might say, why are these properties co-instantiated? And I think the answer that some philosophers at least give is a causal one. These properties tend to be causally linked. So what we're interested in when we're investigating various domains is in identifying properties that are in turn causally linked to other properties. And these are special because they enable us to make projections, inductive inferences, generalizations, and so on. So when we classify things on the basis of a natural classification scheme, what we are revealing is these clusters of properties that are associated together as a matter of causality. And the philosopher Richard Boyd has articulated what he calls the accommodation thesis. And he says, we're able to identify true generalizations in science and in everyday life because we're able to accommodate our inductive practices to the causal factors that sustain them. So in other words, induction works because it reveals properties that are causally linked to other properties. And our classifications ought to track those kinds of properties. And that's those classifications that track those kinds of properties are going to be inductively successful. Boyd says that natural kind categories identify causal mechanisms that keep clusters of properties in equilibrium or in homeostasis. So he says that the particular causal link that he thinks characterizes at least many natural kinds is that there's a causal mechanism that is involved in keeping clusters of properties in equilibrium. And this account of natural kinds has therefore come to be called the homeostatic property cluster account, or the HPC account. Now, I would argue that the HPC account is a bit restrictive because very often when we're trying to understand the causal structure of the world, what we find is not so much it is not always a causal mechanism that keeps a set of properties in equilibrium, but what we do find is causal associations between properties that need not conform to this, I think, fairly rigid model. So a less restrictive view would have it that natural kind categories identify real causal patterns in the world and they track causal processes. So we're interested in discovering properties that are causally linked to other properties, but not necessarily in the manner of causal mechanisms that keep clusters of properties in equilibrium. So instead of the HPC theory, I would argue for a simple causal theory of kinds, according to which natural kinds are clusters of properties that are causally linked to other properties, not necessarily by way of these mechanisms that keep the properties in equilibrium. And I'm following here some other philosophers of science, particularly Carl Craver, who introduced this idea of a simple causal theory, and I've also tried to elaborate it in some of my work. Now, what does this mean for the causal domain? So much about natural kinds. What about natural kinds in the social domain? Well, kinds in the social domain, I think, conform to some very similar or have some of the same features, because the social sciences also try to come up with classification schemes. They also try to come up with categories on the basis of which they classify individuals, institutions, events, and so on in the social realm. And here too, classification seems to be largely on the basis of clusters of properties or attributes that enable us to explain and predict. And again, these properties are causally linked to other properties. That's why they're so useful in prediction and explanation. Why does something have such and such a feature? Well, because it has this other feature, and feature 1 is causally linked to feature 2. Property 1 is causally linked to property 2, and that's why they're characterized by both of these properties. Members of this kind, if they have one of the properties, they will tend to have the other one, and so on. And it seems as though we have a similar kind of practice in the social science of trying to understand the causal structure of the social domain as opposed to the natural domain or natural domains. So there's causal clustering that occurs in the social domain, just as it does in the biological, geological, medical, and so on. So social kinds are none other than natural kinds in the social domain, just as biological kinds are natural kinds in the biological domain. And this is why I said a little while ago, this phrase natural kind, which we owe to John Venn, is somewhat confusing, especially when we try to deploy it when it comes to the social domain or social ontology, because it can sometimes seem a little jarring to talk about natural social kinds, because the natural and the social are sometimes contrasted. But if you think of natural kinds not as having to do with the natural sciences, but natural just in the sense of maybe real, what we're talking about, it seems to me, when we're talking about social kinds, is just real kinds in the social domain. So maybe real kind is a preferable phrase or expression than natural kinds. So what would be examples of social kinds? Well, a lot of the categories that social scientists use to understand the social world, because they're so useful in predicting and explaining, it seems to me are so because they've managed to identify properties that are causally linked to other properties. So categories like class, race, gender, government, corporation, money, inflation, trade union, and so on, they're useful to us precisely because they've managed to identify real causal patterns in the social realm. And you can think of the kinds in the social domain as with kinds in other domains as coming in various ontological varieties. So you can have kinds of individual, but you can also have kinds of group. You can have kinds of institution, kinds of object or artifact. So artifactual kinds are sometimes contrasted with social kinds, but it seems to me a lot of artifactual kinds play an important role in the social domain and participate in causal processes. So you think of something like the printing press and its influence on various social transformations and developments in the modern world, how it led to the rise of literacy and the emergence of the middle class and so on. That's a kind of object or artifact, which is also something that is a central element in the social structure of the world. Kinds of event, market crash, political revolution, kinds of process, inflation, industrialization. And there may be other varieties of social kinds. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of the various ontological categories into which kinds can be divided. But I think it accounts for a fairly wide range of social kinds. And for some social kinds, it might not be clear which variety they belong to. So money is often thought of as a kind of institution, but it might also be thought of as a kind of object or artifact, although that might not apply very well to electronic money or cryptocurrencies or something like that. And finally, I want to end with a thought concerning a certain distinction among social kinds. So it seems as though social kinds are largely mind-dependent. Almost all social kinds that I can think of are mind-dependent, even though it might be possible that some social kinds are not mind-dependent, but I won't try and get into that right now. But one interesting thing about social kinds is that some of them seem to depend on our having a concept of those kinds, and others don't depend on our having a concept of those kinds. So in some cases, we don't have to represent the kinds as such. So the philosopher Amy Thomason has some nice examples of kinds like recession or racism that may be manifested in the world without anyone having a concept of them or representing them as such. So there can be an economic recession, and presumably there were economic recessions, perhaps before economists came up with the concept of recession. But now other social kinds do seem to be concept dependent. They seem to need to be represented as such to exist. So the kind money, you might have a certain commodity that starts being used as a medium of exchange, and people don't think of it as money. And at first, we might say we don't really have money, but then eventually we start seeing that commodity as being not just any old commodity, whatever it might be, whether it's the infamous case of cowrie shells or gold pieces or something like that. And then we start thinking of it as something special, but it's only when we start thinking of it as not being any old commodity that it really becomes money and really gets transformed into, say, a medium of exchange or a store of value and so on. And moreover, there are other social kinds where it seems that the kind itself and each token, each instance of the kind is also concept dependent. So prime minister, it seems as though we can't have the kind prime minister until we have a concept of prime minister and then apply it to particular people. But then every person who is a prime minister has to be explicitly represented as such. You can't have a prime minister whom no one thinks of as being a prime minister. So it seems as though this is an interesting distinction among different kinds of social kinds, and it might explain some of the features, why some social kinds are different from others, and why they seem to come into existence or maybe fall out of existence in a different way from other social kinds. But I'm going to leave it there, and maybe you want to think about it some more. Anyway, I hope this has been a useful introduction to the whole topic of social kinds, at least the way I see it. And I hope that if anyone has any comments or questions or thinks of any errors that I made, you can feel free to email me and tell me about it. I'd be interested and very happy to talk some more. Thank you.